Dame Edna is one of those few people that can make me laugh so hard that I cry. It's kind of hard to stand up and talk about much of anything after you have that reading from the Buddha, which says, don't listen to what anybody tells you. But rather than telling you, I'm hoping to share with you a bit of my experience that I found especially profound. And whenever I do that, I'm reminded of the Steve Martin movie, The Jerk, that begins as he's in a bed with him doing a voiceover. I was born a poor black child. I was born a middle-class Methodist child. And along the way, somehow, I became a Congregationalist. I then departed for a Roman Catholic college and left. I went back to a Methodist church immediately after having been told the following joke. There is a faith healer. And I'm ashamed to admit that back in the history of my family, there were traveling tent revival faith healing preachers. So this one rings true a little bit, although not to my personal experience. And he came to a new town and set up camp in the town and was going to have a revival and set up a big tent. And the day of the meeting came, everybody from town showed up, and he did his thing and got the crowd pretty worked up, and he called people down who needed to be healed, and two men came forward. One was walking with crutches, the kind that wrap around your forearms, and the other one didn't appear to have anything physically that was wrong with him. The man with crutches stepped up first, and the faith healer, who had a southern accent, because they all do, said, "What's your name, son, and what ails you?" He said, "Well, my name is Fred, and I have birth defects in both legs. I've had to use crutches to walk all my life." And the faith healer said, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And Fred said, "Yes, I do." And the faith healer said, "Go behind that curtain and be healed." So off he went. Next man said, he said, "What's your name, son, and what ails you?" He said, "My name is Bob, and I stubborn." He said, "Bob, do you believe in Jesus?" Bob just nodded his head. He said, "Go behind the curtain and be healed." And so he went into his incantations and his prayers, whipping the crowd up into a frenzy. He turned to the curtain and yelled, "Fred, throw out your crutches." And the crutches came sailing out over the top of the curtain. He said, "Bob, speak to us." And a voice said, "Fa fa 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 fa." Fred fell down. And so I heard this joke, and I wandered into a Methodist church. I had recently moved to New England, and I wanted to find a church home, and my family were all Methodists, and I didn't have a very positive congregational experience, and so I went into this Methodist church. It was an old building. It was a bi-level sort of affair. You came in, and if you went down the stairs, that's where the fellowship hall was, and the classrooms and the offices, and you went up a half flight of stairs to get to the worship space. And I walked in, and there was a handful of people in there. And the hymn board had been turned into an attendance board. And it indicated that it was a small gathering pretty much all the time. And I looked at the bulletin, and it said that there was a minister there once a month, and the other 3 Sundays of the month, people in the congregation took turns leading worship. And this would be one of those Sundays, and they had a young woman who was going to give the sermon, who was a guest. And so as we're gathering, and the music starts, and they process in, the young woman who's going to give the sermon was wearing those crutches with the parts that go around her forearms. And I heard a telephone start to ring in the basement. Well, the usher, as ushers are required to be, was probably as old as Methuselah. And it took him quite a while to get to the phone, which must have had a speaker on the level of the worship space, because you could hear it over the organ and people singing. And finally got to it, and by now they were all up front, and the song was done. The worship leader started the call to worship, and the usher appeared at the back and said, "The Smith's house has burned down." The woman in the pew in front of me reached into her purse, honestly, pulled out a little vial and took a nitroglycerin pill. There were gasps and shrieks around the space. The poor guy leading the worship obviously didn't know what to do, so he just continued as if he hadn't heard anything. And I thought, that's kind of bad. He didn't even say, "Are they okay?" He just forged ahead. He was trapped in on what his job was. And it came time for the sermon, and the woman with the crutches stepped up to the pulpit, and I noticed there was one step up into the pulpit. And she did her best. I want to be fair, she did her best. She had read that footprints poem about how there's two sets of footprints walking down the beach, and then there's only one, and that was when God was carrying her. And she found that to be true. She forgot about that step, and so when she stepped back, the crutches went up in the air, and a little man appeared on my shoulder and said, "Fa-ha, fa-ha." Fred fell down. Well, now I'm laughing uncontrollably at this poor woman who's fallen over. And the platform was hollow, so when she hit, I mean, it was like a bass drum being hit. And the worship leader got up, thank God, and went over to see if she was okay, and she was. And they got her back on her pins, and all I could think of is, oh my God, they're going to process to the back, and I have to pull myself together in time to greet her on the way out, which made me laugh harder. But I finally did it. I was the last person out of the church. And the next week I went into an Episcopal church, and nothing funny happened, and I stayed for 15 years. So the things that move us in our understanding of our beliefs are not always necessarily the beliefs themselves. And I spent my time in the Episcopal Church, and I ran afoul of the politics in the Episcopal Church for the same reason I run afoul of people on Facebook. And it's that I say what's on my mind. And when the Bishop of Milwaukee said to me, "People like you can never be normal," I said, you know, in AA, they define insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I left. I withdrew from the discernment process for ordination and was ordained in a little independent Catholic church, which had been born in 1971 after about 5 years of struggle in Waukesha to establish themselves as their own parish. And they liked the folk mass, and they liked it so much that they were still doing the folk mass in 1999. In fact, they most likely, well, they were definitely still doing it in 2008 when I left. And I'm sure did it this morning, all the while imagining that they're quite progressive and cutting edge. And I really don't say that, well, I do say it to be critical, but that's not really the reason I bring it up. The reason I bring it up is because we can become trapped in our vehicles. Because our vehicles, like the dog in the Tale from the Golden Castle, which, by the way, was written by Father John Julian of the Order of Julian of Norwich in Waukesha. A man, the founder of the Order of Julian of Norwich, actually, who now is retired and lives as a hermit, but was a man whom my parish priest in Trinity Episcopal referred to as that nutcase. But when you hear the allegories he's written about the spiritual journey, I don't want to say that he's not a nut. It was not my experience of him ever. But maybe you have to be just a little bit of a nut to follow the journey to its conclusion. Along the way, I finished the undergraduate I had started at Marquette at Wisconsin Lutheran College because I wanted a place that believed very differently than I did. And one of the things they said to me that's always stuck with me and was so inconsistent with my own experience is that being good Lutherans, and I don't know if you know this, but to a good Lutheran, Martin Luther is the fourth person of the Trinity. Being good Lutherans, they couldn't admit that there's anything that we have the power to do as human beings about much of anything, because they were really, really good Lutherans. And so to them, you didn't get up to use the bathroom, except for an act of grace by God. And so, needless to say, I struggled with that, but they were so very concerned that there's nothing we could do to most definitely advance ourselves in terms of our beliefs or our understandings of God or divinity or anything else, that they said that a very pivotal book. It was written by James Fowler in the early 80s called Stages of Faith Development. I may be a little off on the title. Couldn't possibly be true because it suggested that we developed, that we progressed, that we took a journey, that we moved towards a destination. And M. Scott Peck came along and did what he does best and oversimplified it into 4 stages instead of 6. Forgot all about children and adolescents, but applied it all to adults, and that's actually helpful in a lot of ways. But rather than talk about that, I just want to raise it as an idea. I considered talking about it, and then I decided it was really quite boring. And so I wouldn't. But other people have done the same thing. Other people have posited that there's sort of this continuum of spiritual growth. Andrew Cohen, one of the collection of people who announced himself enlightened at age 28, which is an oxymoron as far as I'm concerned, but it started when I was 28. I know what I was doing when I was 28. There wasn't anything enlightened about it. But maybe he's special. And got together with Ken Wilber, the largest ego known to humankind, but still had a good philosopher. Just wish he keeps clothes on in his YouTube videos. This suggests that there's a ladder of spiritual development, and they put colors on it. It was all very nice colors related to the chakra. It's all very pretty, or the chakras rather. And it's all very pretty, and it's not unlike Walter Hilton from medieval England, who I had to study when I was an oblate of the Order of Julian of Norwich, which is how I got to know Father John Julian, as if anybody really cares. And still, it's vertical. And how do you say to somebody, "Oh, you're a few rungs below me"? Which brings me to the Facebook discussion that I mentioned before we started that I had last night, when I dared to suggest that somebody wasn't present at the creation with a notepad, and that the fact that God created them male and female, and Noah took one of each on the ark, was irrelevant to the issue of human sexuality and sexual orientation. Because I never said that there were men and women and something else. What if it's a box? What if it's not a ladder, but it's a box? And spiritual evolution is a matter of moving around in a 3-dimensional space. So what if this altar, if we hadn't put this flag in front of it, turned it into a 2-dimensional object instead of a 3, I guess, was spiritual development, spiritual growth, the spiritual journey. And what if the back of the altar was conservative and the front was progressive? And what if, and I hesitate to use the bottom and the top, but if it's 3-dimensional, there has to be one. The bottom of the altar is the belief that what matters most is belief. And the top of the altar was the belief that what matters most is practice. The things I do as part of my spiritual journey. And what if this side of the altar here was all about social justice? And what if the far side of the altar for me was all about devotional spirituality? And it wasn't just a matter of moving in a straight line, but floating around in that box as we go through life. So sometimes we're more conservative and we're closer to the back. And we're more concerned with right practice, which I think was the bottom. And we're really more concerned about our own devotional journey, so we're floating in 3 dimensions somewhere over there. And we have the freedom, as life circumstances change and our needs change, to float around inside that box. And you can't really say that anybody's closer to the end of the journey than anybody else. They're just in a different space in this 3-dimensional container, dependent on a lot of things. Well, what's my life experience? What if I had never walked into that bi-level Methodist church? I wouldn't remember that joke. And that's pretty trivial, but that's true about beliefs too. When I went to that first church that I served, they did a Lenten book study every year. And I wanted to be a good pastor, so I said, "What was your book last year?" And they said, "Living Buddha, Living Christ" by Thich Nhat Hanh. And I said, "How do you spell that?" Because I didn't know. I knew how to spell living Buddha, living Christ. It was the Thich Nhat Hanh. And I read the book, and my eyes were blown open. And I suddenly realized that everything those good folks at the Order of Julian of Norwich are trying to teach me about contemplative prayer that I couldn't get was present in Buddhist teachings about meditation that said, well, for crying out loud, anchor your thoughts to your breath. And I said, well, I can do that. And then I discovered mantra practice. I discovered that it was probably more uniquely suited to my personality, particularly at times when my mind gets a little hyperactive. Not that that ever happens. And the more I understood about that, and the closer I drew to the God I found inside that particular practice, the more I realized what the people back on the Christian side of the coin had been saying about the Orthodox practice of prayer ropes and the Jesus prayer, mantra practice. And the more I started to see that there was this great commonality between religious traditions, and that if we wanted to, we could get caught in the minutiae. We could get caught on one of the sides of the box. But to be pinned up against the side of the box is to experience the smallest part of the box possible. Whereas moving around inside of it gives you more, but it requires. I think this is so pivotal, and this is why it's very serendipitous that particular reading from the Golden Castle came up, because we've just been working through the book. But you have to let go of the dog. The train, and if it weren't a dog, it'd be so much easier to let go of, because I'm not a dog person, right? But the train takes you to the station, and if you never get out of the train, you haven't really gotten where you're going. And sometimes we forget that there's trains leaving the station going in other directions too. Which is another reason I like that three-dimensional model. What if spiritual evolution, spiritual growth, spiritual changes throughout our lives and beyond them isn't so much about any of the stations, but is about